but let's start with the first one. Who was the naturalist on board HMS Beagle? The answer's simple. It wasn't Darwin. The official ship's naturalist, at least at the beginning of the voyage, was the surgeon. A man named McCormick. That was entirely traditional on British ships at the time and met usual naval practice. Therefore, and this is the obvious point of my inquiry, if Darwin was not the official naturalist, why was he there? What was he doing on board for this 5-year voyage? And the answer to this lies with this fascinating figure of the Beagle's captain, Robert Fitzroy, a mercurial, mentally ill, fascinating man, if ever there was one. And here's the tale. Fitzroy was wealthy and very ambitious and wanted to make the Beagle voyage, which was primarily a surveying voyage of the South American coast, the best conducted scientific voyage ever. But the British Admiralty didn't give him enough men or equipment. He was permitted to take supernumerary passengers at his own expense, and he decided to beef up the Beagle's scientific mettle. He brought a cartographer, he brought several other people at his own expense so that it could be a better scientific voyage. But that's not primarily what Darwin was there. Darwin was there for personal reasons. Fitzroy was very afraid of his own mental state. The previous captain of the Beagle had shot himself and killed himself at sea. Fitzroy understood something about his own mental instability, a correct assumption, by the way, and knew the psychological toll that long sea voyages took. It's very hard from a current psychologically more enlightened age to get back into British naval practice in the early mid-19th century and see what happened. But Fitzroy's aristocratic. These voyages were long. They could be away from port for as much as 3 months. An aristocratic captain was not allowed by social convention any contact beyond the merest giving of ship's orders to any of the crew unless they matched his social status, and no one did or would. So Fitzroy had to be absolutely alone for periods that could range up to 3 months. He would eat alone. He had his own room. Now, in that circumstance, it was characteristic for captains to bring along companions. Some brought their wives. And Fitzroy decided, as many other captains had, to bring along a companion, someone to share his meals. But while he was doing that, for personal reasons, might as well be someone with an interest in natural history so he could get a little more scientific aptitude into the Beagle crew. So he advertised discreetly among his friends for a gentleman, it had to be someone of the same social class, with an interest in natural history who might sail as his companion. And Darwin certainly fit the bill. He had graduated from Cambridge, although he was studying to be a parson. I don't think he ever had much interest in religion. I think what he had in mind was that notion of the parson amateur naturalist who could collect beetles and monograph the beetles of his burrow, because that was a well-understood tradition. Now, Darwin's passion was for natural history. He was certainly of the right social class. His grandfather had been Erasmus Darwin, noted physician and philosopher. His father was a very wealthy and well-connected physician in the English Midlands. And so Darwin went along. One other thing about Fitzroy, he was obsessed with the death of his beloved uncle, Viscount Castlereagh, this magnificently interesting figure in British history, who has to his discredit the suppression of the Irish Peasant Revolt of 1798, to his credit the negotiation of the treaty that allowed our country to get out of the War of 1812, which we really lost without losing face, and therefore set the basis for friendship between England and America. But Castlereagh, who was clearly, by modern standards, bipolar manic depressive, had during one of his depressive episodes taken a knife and slit his throat. Fitzroy, who looked so much like Castlereagh and idolized him, felt that he was subject to exactly the same malady, as he clearly was. And indeed, it's one of the ironies, if not further relevant to this lecture, that Fitzroy died by his own hands. He slit his own throat in exactly the same manner as his uncle did later in 1865. Fitzroy, in fact, did break down at one point during the Beagle voyage and relinquish command for a few weeks. I think Fitzroy had a very acute perception of his mental state and brought Darwin as a social companion. Now, why is that important? Simply because you have to get this picture in your head that for 5 years, Darwin is in the thrall of this mercurial, strong, compassionate man who you never know how he's going to react, who is superior to you. Darwin writes this moving line in his autobiography later. He says, "You cannot imagine," he writes, "the awe with which the captain of a British man-of-war was held during my youth. No one could contradict any of his words. So here's Darwin, one of those brilliant men in the history of Western thought, in a sense confined with Fitzroy to share meals in these cramped quarters every day for 5 years. Now, the rest is conjecture. There was no fly on the wall. The two men clearly had affection for each other. I'm not saying they ever came to blows, as they did at moments. But when you conjecture and look into the relationship of Darwin and Fitzroy, they were such different personalities. And Darwin's necessity of keeping silent and covering things up that he believed during this very long period, I have a feeling meant a great deal to him in the development of his theories later. So I'm using Darwin versus Fitzroy ideologically as a metaphor for what is the most radical feature of Darwin's theory. There were two great subjects. I mean, what do people argue about in bull sessions, right? Politics, religion, and sex. I don't know what they thought about the third, but they certainly came to utter disagreement on the first two, politics and religion. And in politics, for example, Fitzroy was a committed Tory and a great supporter of slavery. Darwin was an equally committed Whig and an abolitionist who wrote, if you read the last chapter of the Voyage of the Beagle, some of the most moving passages ever penned against the slave trade. So certainly on that issue of slavery, which Darwin just kept quiet about, except at one point where they had a little incident that almost led to a fracturing of their relationship. Clearly things were tense, and Darwin kept it cool by staying off subjects that he knew would anger the mercurial Fitzroy. Darwin's religious views, to get to the second subject, were changing and weren't clear. There's no evidence that he was unorthodox at that time. But if Fitzroy had two idées fixes in his life, one was Tory politics, and the other was his take on religion. Fitzroy was an ardent supporter of the most traditional and conventional view about the interaction of religion and the natural world at that time, this doctrine called natural theology. Natural theology, which is epitomized in William Paley's book of the same name, published in 1802, which Darwin said he loved as a young man. Natural theology is a particularly English take on the relationship of God to the world, which says that God's existence and his attributes, his omnipotence, his benevolence, are manifested in the works of the creation. In other words, if you study the works of the creation, natural phenomena, you will find the evidence not only for God's existence, but also for his attributes. In particular, natural theology tended to focus on the good design of organisms and the harmony of ecosystems. So that from the fact that organisms are well designed and that ecosystems are harmonious, one is supposed to be able to infer not only God's existence, but also his omnipotence and his goodness. Fitzroy was as committed to that as he was to his Tory politics. Now, if we know they almost came to blows on the political issues, think of Darwin, one of the most brilliant men in Western history, already developing doubts about natural theology and the theological interpretation of natural history in general, having to listen to Captain Fitzroy day after day, unable to confute him, and hearing over and over again the argument from design, the good design of organisms, the harmony of ecosystems. That's where God is manifest. That's where his attributes are clear. Now, Fitzroy, as he became unhinged later in life, came to see himself as the unwitting agent of Darwin's apostasy, but I think he was right in a deeper way than he ever realized. It is true that Fitzroy showed up demented at the famous meeting where Huxley and Wilberforce had their debate in 1860, holding a Bible above his head, shouting, the book, and claiming that he had been, as I said, the agent of Darwin's apostasy. But I think he only blamed himself for having taken Darwin to the Galapagos and other places. I don't know if he ever appreciated how much this forced daytime conversation, meal after meal after meal, may well have set Darwin thinking. How could one of the most brilliant men in the history of Western thought have listened to these views expressed by a man he could not confute day after day after day? How did it rankle with him? How did it shape his views? Now, this is conjecture, to be sure. I use this story metaphorically, but it's interesting that the most radical feature of Darwin's theory, its naturalism, its commitment to a purposeless nature out there versus whatever humans do, is set up in the logic of Darwin's system, the theory of natural selection, as a direct, almost mordant contradiction of natural theology. It's set up as a refutation of it. And that's why I bring up the Darwin-Fitzroy connection. Now, let's think about it.